Thanks so much, Evan. It's a really a pleasure for me to be here this afternoon. As you said, I'm Jason Keller. I am a Kravis professor of integrated sciences. My background is in wetland ecology, and I'm new here. I came from Chapman University before this, where I was for about 15 years. And I'm really excited to be here this afternoon to chat a little bit about two of my very favorite topics, wetlands and climate change, and really excited to start making connections to alumni and parent communities that are such an important part of Claremont and McKenna. Let me say that the talk that I want to give today is one that focuses on the accomplishments of a bunch of really brilliant CMC student collaborators who are working to answer really, really hard scientific questions. Students who are able to approach these questions with interdisciplinary frames and the strong computational skill sets that they've developed through the innovative curriculum in the Kravis Department of Integrated Sciences. Of course, all of this work takes place and is enabled by the gorgeous facilities in the new Robert Day Sciences Center here on CMC's campus. But the reality, to be totally frank, is that that's not a talk that I can give, or at least not a talk that I can give quite yet. I arrived at CMC in July. And if I'm being totally honest, I'm still figuring out the right way to turn my cup at the Athenaeum to get the right type of coffee when I show up. I'm part of a pretty incredible team of faculty and staff working really hard to build that innovative curriculum that we think is going to be the Kravis Department of Integrated Sciences. And this is the current image as of yesterday morning of the Robert Day Sciences Center. And it's super excited to see these towers kind of rising out of the ground and the progress that's being made at the site. But I think it's fair to say that the building is not quite ready yet for cutting edge research with amazing undergraduates. And to be clear, I sort of start with this, not as any sort of complaint or criticism. I can say pretty honestly that the past 3 months as a member of the CMC faculty have been some of the most intellectually challenging and some of the most important months of my academic career to date. And I am both genuinely excited and humbled to be a part of CMC at this moment in its history. But I start with these caveats today to make the point that what I am going to be talking about is really potential. What I want to do today is share some thoughts about the types of scholarship that I'm excited to get up and running at CMC with CMC students and with other 5C students. And I think importantly, what I hope to showcase today is that even with something as esoteric as anaerobic wetland biogeochemistry, which is what I do for a living, that even that idea relies fundamentally on the integration of ideas from across the natural sciences, the humanities, and the social sciences. And this idea of integration that's going to be at the core of our new program is true for all of the big scientific questions that exist in our world today. And so I hope I can show you the types of things that I'm excited about and why they fit so well in the Kravis Department of Integrated Sciences. I'm a wetland biogeochemist, and so I like to start talks like this with a definition of what I mean when I say wetland. And the definition that I'm sharing with you here is from the United States government. This is what's used by the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers in a variety of sort of regulatory contexts. And I think it matches pretty well with the current scientific definition of wetlands. And that is that wetlands are unique areas on our landscape that are characterized by three things. They're characterized by their hydrology, they're characterized by particular soil types, and they're characterized by particular types of vegetation. Of those three things, one of them is really important, and it's the hydrology. Quite simply, wetlands are lands that are wet. They are defined by the presence of water at the surface or just below the surface for relatively long periods of time. And we'll come back to this idea over and over again in the presentation, but the fact that these are lands with soils that are constantly flooded, that presence of water makes these systems really, really unique from an ecological perspective and allows them to do all sorts of really interesting things that other ecosystems aren't able to do. And while I think this is a perfectly fine definition to get us started, what I like to do in a conversation like this is ask people to get a mental picture of a wetland. And in particular, what I'd like you to do is think of a fictional wetland. Think of a wetland from literature, think of a wetland from a movie, and think about how that wetland was used as a plot point. What happened in that wetland in the movie? And I think this exercise shows a lot about how we have historically thought about these ecosystems as a society. I will argue all day long with anyone on this call or anyone else that there is one right answer to that prompt, and that is Dagobah from the Star Wars universe. So Dagobah is the swamp planet in Empire Strikes Back, where Luke Skywalker flies off to meet the very wise and very sage Yoda. And what I want us to think about in the movie is, what is that place doing as a plot device? And for those of you that haven't seen the movie, Luke approaches Dagobah in his X-Wing, which is his starfighter, and immediately the controls stop working. The sensors don't work anymore. The technology basically goes dead as he gets close to this wetland. He comes in and he lands his X-Wing, and the first thing that happens is his X-Wing sinks down to the mud and is no longer functional. This is a world that is foggy and dark and spooky, and there's snakes and spiders everywhere. R2-D2 gets out to explore the planet and is immediately swallowed up by some water monster, right? This is a place that exists in the Star Wars universe to tell us that it's not a good place to be. It's dark, it's scary, it's riddled with negative connotations. And we see these negative connotations around wetlands in countless examples. We can think about the dead marshes in the Lord of the Rings books and the Lord of the Rings movies. These are wetland ecosystems that Frodo and Sam and Gollum only walk through when there is literally no other choice but to walk through. Only reason that you go into wetlands is when all the orcs of Mordor block your path to go around the wetlands. These wetlands are literally filled with dead bodies. There is no more negative connotation that you can assign to an ecosystem than that. We see this more recently in an example that my students recognize in the Shrek movies. Shrek is an ogre that hates to be bothered by people. Where do you live if you don't want to be bothered by sensible people? Well, you live in a swamp, because only people like ogres or only creatures like ogres would live in such a horrible place as a swamp, right? Sensible, well-intentioned people would never set foot in such an awful landscape. And for the more literary folks in the bunch, this is an image of Gripen Mire. This is the wetland in England that was the setting for The Hound of the Baskervilles, the Sherlock Holmes stories. Because if you expect to find a crazy ghost dog, of course a crazy ghost dog is going to live in these dark and scary wetland environments. And I like to start with these examples because it shows us how we think about wetlands as a society. Right? These are dark and scary places. That's built into our cultural understanding of what we envision when we think about wetlands. Indeed, we see this in our language. The students on campus right now are swamped by all the assignments that we're giving them. They're feeling really bogged down in that essay that they need to write by Thursday. And one of them just shared with me that they're really feeling mired by the Python assignment that we just gave them in the Sci 10 Codes of Life class. The way that we use words like bogs, swamps, mires, all types of wetlands in the English language brings along all of these negative connotations. These are places that for a very long time we viewed as not particularly valuable to society. And that view has some really fascinating, if not predictable, consequences for the policies that we've written and the social choices that we've made about wetlands. And I'll give us just a couple examples of that. So if we look at the state of California, California has lost about 90% of the wetland area that existed in the state prior to European colonization, right? That's something like 2 million hectares, which equates to roughly 4 million football fields worth of wetlands that used to exist in California and no longer exist in California. And they don't just disappear from the landscape, right? We are making choices as a society to replace wetlands, systems that we don't value a whole lot, with other systems that as a society at the time, we value more. And we see the same pattern playing out across the entirety of the United States. If we look at the lower 48 of the United States, we've done slightly better, I guess. We've only lost 50% of the wetlands in the lower 48, but that equates to almost 100 million football fields worth of wetlands that we have viewed as so worthless that we've converted them into other land uses that we find more valuable, right? So these cultural views of wetlands play out exactly in the environmental history of wetland conservation in the United States. And there's all sorts of policy pieces that go along with that because policies have to be in place to allow for these land use changes to happen. What I want to try and do today is show you that perception of wetlands as dark, scary places full of snakes and spiders and fog and snakes and things that eat our 2 units is starting to change. Right? We are now at a place where I think many of us, if we imagine a real wetland that we've kayaked through or gone bird watching in or jogged around, these are actually real gems on our landscape. This is one of my favorites. This is a wetland that I get to work in outside of Fairbanks, Alaska for a research project that I have. And, you know, with the exception of sometimes a few too many mosquitoes, this is a lovely ecosystem. There's absolutely nothing dark and scary about this wetland at all. And I think we see this change in perception as viewing wetlands as resources that we want to conserve, that we want to protect, and in many cases, investing resources in actual restoring wetlands, putting them back on the landscape to where they used to be a couple hundred years ago. That is happening more broadly within the United States and globally. We've had a shift in our cultural perspective of what these wetlands mean. We now understand that they're actually pretty valuable ecosystems and things that we might want to think about having around on the landscape around us. Part of the reason, I think, for that change in perspective is a sort of really renewed scientific focus on the value that wetland ecosystems add to us. What we now know and what the scientific community is demonstrating on a pretty regular basis is that the ecosystems aren't just nice to look at, but they do a lot of unique things. And many of the things that they do, many of the ecosystem functions in wetlands provide tangible services to us as human society. They make our communities more resilient. They protect our communities. They provide economic livelihood to people that live within our society. And I'll give you a couple examples of this. One of the things that we know wetlands are really good at is they are incredibly important habitat for a large number of species. And so this is a Ridgway's rail, which is a bird species that is found throughout salt marshes in Southern California. This is a picture from the Upper Newport Bay, for those of you that have spent some time along the coast in Orange County. The Ridgway's rail is one of many threatened or endangered bird species that is entirely dependent on wetlands for habitat. This is where it lives, this is where it breeds, this is where it feeds, right? And it's really hard to disconnect birds and wetlands, right? The conservation work that has been done by birders to help protect wetlands has been really important in the conservation history of wetlands. Just thinking about duck clubs, organizations like Ducks Unlimited that are protecting wetlands so people can actively hunt ducks, the conservation implications of groups like that and connections of communities of hunters to these systems has been really, really important. But this ecosystem service of providing important habitat isn't just limited to birds. We estimate that something like 40% of the world's terrestrial species live or breed in wetlands. They spend at least a portion of their life cycle in these wetland environments. And it's something like 30% of the known fish species spend at least one part of their life cycle in wetlands, right? And this includes all of the fish species that drive the billion-dollar commercial fisheries industry. And so if we think about all of the economics that we get from shellfish, right? If we think about all of the jobs that are created by that industry, if we think about all of the communities that have fed themselves and fed the larger world because of those activities, it doesn't happen without wetlands existing on our landscape. Another example of an ecosystem service that's showing highlighting the value of these systems, something like 60% of the human population lives or works along coastlines. And we know from watching the news at all, that those coastlines are already seeing higher rates of hurricane storm activity and increased intensity of hurricane storm activity. One of the things that wetlands are really good at is acting like a giant sponge. They are really good at absorbing massive amounts of water, and they're really good at absorbing massive amounts of energy. If somebody here is going to throw a rock at me, putting a sponge between that rock and myself is a good idea. And wetlands can act like that sponge for coastal communities. And so there are coastal communities around the world that are thinking about how to integrate wetlands onto the coast, or in many cases, put wetlands back onto the coast to provide this important ecosystem service of community protection. And so rather than just relying on what we call gray infrastructure, big piles of rocks and big concrete walls, we are thinking now about how we build coastal communities that rely on green infrastructure, salt marshes that can help provide that storm protection, also support birds, also support fish. And I'll give one more example. And this is kind of a classic wetland ecosystem service that we've known about and take advantage of for a long time. Wetlands are often referred to as the kidneys of the landscape because the fact that they are flooded soil environments that contain vegetation, they have really, really unique chemistry. And one of the unique aspects of that chemistry is that they are terrific at getting rid of any number of pollutants. And this is things like nutrients that we don't want running into coastal waterways. This is things like oil contamination. This is things like physical waste, right? Wetlands are really, really, really good at cleaning water. And we take advantage of this all of the time already as an ecosystem service. And so the example in the image that I'm showing you is coming from the San Bernardino Metropolitan Water District, which is just down the road from us. We're actually working with them in our Sci 10 class this semester. But like many other water treatment districts across the world and across the country, they are building, engineering, constructing wetlands where the water, after they do some preliminary treatment, will go and sit in these wetlands to allow it to get kind of finely polished before we put it back into aquifers or before we release it downstream where it makes its way into the coastal ecosystem. And so collectively, these ecosystem services are incredibly valuable to human communities and human societies. There's a number of environmental economists that go through and try and put dollar values on these things. I am not foolish enough to talk about economic models with a group of CMC alumni because I will get myself in trouble. But what I am comfortable saying is that virtually every time we do these economic analyses of ecosystem services, the dollar value provided to society from wetlands is among the highest of any other ecosystem on a per area basis. So meter per meter, wetlands are providing us with all sorts of ecosystem services. And as we work together with economists and scientists and policymakers to recognize those ecosystem services, this is a large part of why we've seen that shift away from viewing these things as wastelands that we want to get rid of, more to valuable ecosystems that we want to conserve, protect, and restore. This ecosystem services is also the connection of wetlands to climate. And I like to make this connection with one of my very, very favorite images of all time. And if we were present in person, I would ask you to take a look at this image and tell me what you think it was. And you would have some lovely guesses. And some of you would say, well, it looks like it might be some sort of giant rock. And some of you would say, well, maybe it's a giant dinosaur egg. And I would say, wow, those are all really great guesses, but they're absolutely wrong. What you are looking at here is a 22-pound pat of butter. This is a 22-pound pat of butter that was discovered in an Irish wetland, a type of wetland called a bog, in 2016. It was actually unearthed by an excavator that was taking peat out of that bog for horticultural purposes. So when we add peat moss to our garden, we're adding soil from wetlands like those we find in Ireland. And so somebody was scraping along and they noticed this pat of butter and they stopped and they said, look at this pat of butter. In and of itself, finding 22 pounds of butter anywhere is interesting. Finding it in a natural ecosystem is more interesting. The most interesting thing about this giant pat of butter is the fact that scientists have carbon dated it. And we know that this pat of butter is something like 2,000 years old, right? So this is something that was laid down in the year 100, roughly, right? And not discovered until 2016. That shouldn't happen. All of us know enough about butter to recognize that if we left 22 pounds of it out on our counter and came back 2,000 years later, it would be pretty rancid, right? It wouldn't just have melted or disappeared. Bacteria would have colonized it and caused it to turn. Fungal spores would have come in, and it would likely be covered with mold, right? That hasn't happened here, right? This butter is still edible. You shouldn't eat it, but in theory, you could still eat it. We're not seeing that rancidness. It is incredibly well preserved. It has been protected from decomposition, protected from those bacteria and those fungi that are coming in to basically eat the carbon in this butter. It has been protected from that decomposition because it was buried in a wetland. It could have been buried in a forest and it wouldn't be there. It could have been buried in a grassland and it wouldn't be there 2,000 years later. It was buried in a particular type of ecosystem, one that is characterized by flooded conditions. And those flooded conditions are what have allowed for this remarkable preservation. Some of you might have seen the so-called bog mummies. Replace the butter with dead Europeans. The same thing. We can find incredibly well-preserved human remnants in these wetland ecosystems that are actually really, really valuable archaeological tools to tell us about how people lived thousands and thousands of years ago. And they only exist in these wetland environments. And the reason for that is because wetland environments are wet. They're flooded. And what happens when you have flooded conditions in nature is that you don't have very much oxygen available, right? This is why we cannot breathe underwater, but fish can, right? As soon as you have water in a system, there's just not much oxygen in that system. In other words, we're creating what's known as anaerobic or low oxygen environments. And the reason why we get this really remarkable preservation in anaerobic wetland environments is because there's no oxygen there. All of those bacteria that would come and ruin the butter if we left it on our kitchen counter, all of those fungi that would come in and decompose the butter if we left it on our kitchen counter, they need oxygen. And they need oxygen for the same reason we need oxygen. Those microorganisms are eating the carbon found in butter. They actually strip electrons off of the organic compounds found in butter. They dump those electrons onto oxygen. And that transfer of electrons is how they generate ATP, which is the unit of energy that makes the vast majority of cells in the world work. This is the exact same biochemistry that every one of us is using right now. We do the same thing with butter. We strip its electrons, we dump those electrons onto oxygen that we breathe in, we decompose the butter, and we release carbon dioxide as a respiratory byproduct. That's the same thing that microbes and fungi like to do when they're on your counter. They can't do that if there's no oxygen around. Now, there's other microbes that exist below the water table level under these anaerobic conditions in wetland ecosystems. They're breathing compounds besides oxygen. They're breathing a bunch of other things. But the energy that they get from those anaerobic processes is very small to the energy that they would get if oxygen was present for thermodynamic reasons. And so you have low energy environments, which means that decomposition goes very, very slowly. All right. The climate connection actually has very little to do with butter. The climate connection has to do with those same anaerobic conditions allow for all sorts of organic material to accumulate in wetland environments. And what really matters in wetland soil is not butter, but a whole bunch of dead plants. So like every other ecosystem on the planet, wetlands are dominated by plants who are using the process of photosynthesis to take carbon dioxide, CO2, what we exhale, out of the atmosphere and convert it into sugars. Plants then use those sugars to make more plants. They convert those sugars into leaves and sticks and roots and stems and all those sorts of things. That plant material gets eaten by cows that turn that carbon dioxide ultimately into butter, but it's all organic compounds. In wetland ecosystems, the plants and the things that eat the plants die. They fall below the water table level where they're decomposed very, very slowly. They're still decomposed, there's still microbes there, but they're microbes that can't use oxygen, and so they do the chewing up of that organic compound very, very slowly. Those microbes are releasing carbon dioxide in the same way that we're releasing carbon dioxide. But because they're limited by anaerobic conditions, they're limited by a lack of oxygen, the carbon dioxide released by decomposition is smaller than the carbon dioxide taken up by the plants. And so wetland ecosystems are characterized by this fundamental imbalance where the plants are taking more carbon out of the atmosphere, turning it into plants, than is being returned to the atmosphere by the decomposition of those plants. Another way of saying this is that a fraction of the dead plants stick around in the wetlands for long periods of time, right? And what this does is it adds lots and lots of carbon into wetland soils. And so on a global scale, we know that wetland soil stores something like 500 petagrams of carbon. That is 500 with 15 zeros after it grams of carbon, a number that is so large that nobody can actually wrap their mind around it. This is way more carbon than we find in the atmosphere right now. And for context, this is about 60 times more carbon than we release annually from the burning of fossil fuels on the entire planet. So huge amounts of carbon has been building up in these soils for about the past 10,000 years because of this imbalance between photosynthesis and anaerobic decomposition. This is important for climate, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. The other important climate connection here is that the very same flooded conditions that take oxygen out of the soils allows for a particular type of microbes called methanogens to do this very slow decomposition of dead plant material. The methanogens, in the absence of oxygen, the methanogens are unique in that unlike us, they don't breathe out carbon dioxide, they breathe out methane, which is abbreviated CH4. If you're paying attention here, you'll recognize carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane as two really important greenhouse gases. These are the greenhouse gases that we are releasing as a human society that are altering the planet. These are the greenhouse gases that are driving climate change, driving warmer temperatures over long time periods, driving sea level rise, driving glacial loss, driving increased wildfires. All those cascading effects associated with the climate change are ultimately driven by increases in these two greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so this is a graph from the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC assessment report that came out in 2021. And I want you to look at the red line, which shows carbon dioxide concentrations over the past 800,000 years. Here's where we are currently. We are regularly hitting carbon dioxide concentrations above 400 parts per million. That's about 50% higher than it was at the start of the Industrial Revolution, right? And that's higher than it's been on the planet for at least the past 800,000 years. The increase in carbon dioxide tied to human activity is responsible for about 60% of the warming that we can contribute to human activity, right? Wetlands play with carbon dioxide on a global scale. They help regulate the natural cycles of this gas. The other gas that we talked about with wetlands is methane, which is shown in the green line on this graph. Again, we can see that it's very, very high right now. It's at about 1,800 parts per billion. That's a very small concentration. That's only 1.8 parts per million. So there's 200 times more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there is methane in the atmosphere. But that's about double the amount of methane that was there a couple hundred years ago prior to Industrial Revolution. And again, it's about the highest concentration that we've seen in the past 800,000 years. This very, very small concentration of methane is responsible for about 20% of the warming ascribed to human activities. And the reason for that is because methane is just a really potent greenhouse gas. It's very, very good at capturing heat in our atmosphere. Both of these gases are impacted by wetland activities. Over the past 10,000 years or so, wetlands have served to take massive amounts of carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere and store it below ground. That cools the planet. But wetlands have also been responsible for releasing massive amounts of methane into the atmosphere. That warms the planet. And on net, these two warming and cooling effects cancel out historically, right, and under natural processes. But what's going to happen in the future? And that is really at the crux of my research program. My research is motivated by the need to understand the fate of carbon that's currently stored in these wetland soils. Is it going to stay there out of the atmosphere, or is it going to be released into the atmosphere as methane, which would create a very strong acceleration or positive feedback with ongoing anthropogenic or human-mediated climate change? I've addressed this question in a number of different ways. One of my very favorite ways to explore this question is to go into the field and use large-scale ecosystem manipulations, where we can basically mimic future climate possibilities in a wetland and see how that wetland responds. This is probably my favorite project that I've ever worked on over my scientific career. This is the spruce and peatland responses under changing environments. This is a project that is run out of the Oak Ridge National Lab, which is a Department of Energy lab, and is actually housed in a wetland ecosystem up in northern Minnesota. It is a feat of engineering. It's an engineering marvel. What they've done is they have these massive chambers. These chambers are 12 meters in diameter, so think 40 feet across, that they've actually installed in a fully functional wetland in Minnesota. And each of these 10 chambers receives a different possible climate scenario. And so there's 5 different temperature treatments that you can apply in the field year-round for close to a decade, right? They're warming the soil down about 10 feet. They're warming the air up until above the highest tree that you find in this wetland. And then we have 2 different CO2 concentrations here. So there are 10 different possible futures that this wetland might experience. And we can go in and look to see how the wetland responds to those possible futures. This has been an absolute joy to take students to this project, right? We were one of the few groups that only worked with undergraduate students at this project, and I've taken a number of students up to Minnesota to let them see what this site looks like and collect peat from this site. This is Emily Torres, one of my former students. She's trying to core down about 2 meters to pull up peat that was laid down in this wetland about 10,000 years ago. The fun of pulling 10,000-year-old peat up and handing it to an undergraduate student is why I do this job. I'm not going to bore you with the nitty-gritty details, but my lab and the undergraduate students that I work with are really on the forefront of identifying this novel process where we can find microbes that breathe organic compounds in the same way that we breathe oxygen. So instead of just using butter as a food source, they're also using butter in place of oxygen to drive their decomposition and drive their respiration. I'm happy to talk at length about the details of this, but I know nobody cares. We're doing some really cool stuff with computer science approaches where we can then take that 10,000-year-old peat, we can look at tens of thousands of individual organic compounds, and we can see which of those compounds the microbes are actually choosing to eat and which of those compounds the microbes are actually choosing to breathe. This is the front end of my research program, and it's something that I'm really excited about. One more question, and then I'll wrap up, that I've worked on in a smaller, this is a smaller part of my research program, but is much more driven towards climate solutions. And that's asking the question of, can wetland soil carbon be used to mitigate climate change? Can we use wetlands, not think about wetlands as just responding to climate change, but thinking of them as a tool to help us mitigate the impacts of climate change? And this is all governed by some really cool policy and economic developments, and in particular, rapidly emerging carbon offset markets, which are worth billions of dollars already and which are likely to be worth even more money in the future. And I'm not going to get into the details here, but essentially what these carbon markets are doing is providing a financial incentive for anybody that can find a way to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it somewhere else for long periods of time. Take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it somewhere else for long periods of time. That's literally the definition of how wetlands work. And so wetland ecologists are moving into this space and finding ways that we can conserve wetlands, right? We can restore wetlands, quantify the carbon that we're stocking away in those wetland soils, and provide a potential revenue stream to support those conservation and restoration efforts. And I've worked on a couple of different projects on this in California, one up in the South Bay salt ponds, which is really fun just south of San Francisco. It was an excuse for me to buy kayaks, which is a good thing to have happen in your research career. And another project in the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge, which is again down in Orange County, where they're trying to help the wetland keep up with sea level rise by spraying soil on top of it. And this has been another couple of really fun projects to take students out into and show them how the same ecology that we think about, the biogeochemistry that we think about, has some policy and economic relevance. And I think I'm going to conclude there to save plenty of time for questions and just say that this is the sort of thing that I want to bring to Claremont and McKenna, that I will bring to Claremont and McKenna, and I will engage our students in. And I hope what I've tried to do here is show that my work, which is pretty narrowly focused on anaerobic biogeochemistry on the surface, but even a topic like that builds on connections to a wide variety of fields and integrates things like ecology and soil science and analytical chemistry and computer science and mathematical modeling and engineering. But also our questions are ultimately framed by questions that come from places like policy and history and economics and rhetoric. I thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions, and my email's on the bottom of the screen if anybody would care to follow up after today. Thanks so much. Evan, field it however you want to field it.
Thank you, Professor Keller. That was fantastic. If anyone has a question, feel free to put it in the chat or virtually raise your hand in the bottom section there of Zoom. I guess I will start, Professor Keller. A lot of our alumni know we're starting a science program, but we don't, when we think about science program, we think of biochemistry, physics, the traditional sense of science, right? Which is what we had at Keck Science and Joint Science at CMC and the Claremont colleges for a long time. So when we think of an integrated sciences program, and then we'll go to Jeff Booth, who just raised his hand, how do you hope this science program that you're helping create integrates with the entire CMC community?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll say it's exactly what we are working on. I think conceptually it's nice to talk about. I think putting some actual curriculum to it is significantly more challenging than just talking about it. I mean, I'll use my work as an example. All of this sort of, can we use wetlands to mitigate climate change? That is fundamentally about, that's an economic question, right? I can help quantify the carbon, right? I'm pretty good at quantifying carbon. I can train students how to quantify carbon, but I can't put dollar values on that if I don't talk to economists. I can't make recommendations to policymakers about whether or not we should expand these protocols into the compliance-based carbon offset without talking to policymakers, right? There are ethical questions around all of this stuff too. Should we do this, right? Should we tell a community that is making their living by converting wetlands to shrimp farms to stop doing that because we now value wetland ecosystems on the coastal landscape? That's a social question, right? That is not a question in the realm of biogeochemistry. And I think there are lots of opportunities, even in my field, to draw those connections. And I think all of the faculty that we've brought on so far, all of the curriculum that we're thinking about is wrestling with these really big science questions. What do we do about climate change? Right? What do we do about, now that we can sequence the human genome and we can do personal medicine, we can do individualized genomics? There are social and policy and ethical questions to all of the big science questions that we wrestle with in our research. And I think collectively, we're all very, very excited about seeing how we pull in really smart CMC faculty in other fields to help us wrestle with those science questions in more meaningful ways and think about how we can communicate our science with the broader community in more meaningful ways.
Thank you. All right, Jeff Booth from Pasadena, if you want to unmute and ask a question.
Thanks. Great talk.
Thanks, Jeff.
I was curious, Evan's previous question kind of started to touch on that, but I was curious whether you're finding the challenges in your particular work in terms of wetlands to be more from a scientific perspective, where there's just some hard challenges to address, or is it more from a policy or a funding sort of support level, where what's it going to take for your work to sort of go to the next level?
So I'm going to give you a really unsatisfactory answer and just say yes. Right? I mean, There are certainly questions that I am working on that are fundamentally limited by needing to walk across the natural science aisle, so to speak, right? This work that I'm doing on microbes that can breathe organic compounds is the most interesting stuff that I've done scientifically in my entire career. I am at the edge of my personal scientific abilities on that question, right? I need to work with really phenomenal analytical chemists who can give me a database of 60,000 organic compounds. I then need to work with computer scientists that can tell me what to do with 60,000 organic compounds and how to make scientific sense of it, right? And so that is fundamentally a natural science question that is going to require me to integrate fields outside of the field that I was trained into. There are other things that, certainly the field of wetland ecology, probably not the forefront of my research and my scholarship right now, that are looking for integration with more social scientists, with more political scientists, with more economists. I'm only dabbling in this carbon offset space, but there are wetland ecologists with the exact same training that I have who are making that the next big thing in their research group. And their challenge is to walk across a different aisle and find folks with expertise outside of the natural sciences to help move that forward. How do we even think about what these policies mean, right? I mean, I'm not really trained as an analytical chemist. I'm not really trained as a computer scientist, but I can fake it in those spaces. I can't fake it in the policy space, right? And so there are lots of opportunities within the fields that I work in. They're not at the forefront of my personal research to really bridge those divides in some really fascinating ways. And there's lots of good examples of folks that I know that are doing that in their own research program.
We have a question in the chat from Jeff Mason. It's about permafrost. Jeff asks, how is permafrost like wetlands? Given the current rate of global warming, is there a way to keep this genie in the bottle?
Yeah, Jeff, great question. And permafrost and wetlands is sort of a blurred line that we could talk for a long time if you don't want to about the difference between a wetland. So permafrost, for those of you who don't know, is defined by a permanent ice layer that exists for the entire year and across multiple years. They tend to have a relatively small amount of soil that exists on top of that ice layer. Oftentimes the soil above the ice layer is really, really highly organic. It's actually characterized by many of the same plants as the wetland ecosystems that I work in northern Minnesota and the wetland that I worked in Alaska. The Alaskan wetland that I showed you is not a permafrost wetland, but right next door are permafrost wetlands. The concern with permafrost is that as it warms up, it's really hard to stay permanently frosty, and that those ice lenses underneath the systems melt completely. This causes the entire system to sort of collapse in upon itself. If you look at aerial images, the permafrost ecologists like to call them drunken trees. You can find where the permafrost is melted because it's melted and the trees have sort of leaned in all cattywampus because it's actually collapsed a little bit. Following that collapse, these things turn into permanently flooded wetland ecosystems. And so now you have lots and lots of carbon that's been stored under ice, remarkable preservation under ice, that's now suddenly not under ice anymore, and it's underwater. And so there's lots of work being done to look to see how much of that carbon is turned into carbon dioxide or is turned into methane. Also, a lot of work that looks more at sort of hydrological modeling to say, once something collapses, how does that collapse change the hydrology of the landscape? And does that accelerate or slow down or have no effect on the thawing of adjacent permafrost wetlands? So really, really similar questions about, is soil carbon that's been there for a long time going to stay there in the future, or is it going to be turned back into, is it going to be returned to the atmosphere? With the major concern, is it going to be returned as the really potent greenhouse gas methane?
A question about what you're currently teaching at CMC. What are you teaching? What will you teach? And will it be available during family weekend for parents to drop in?
Great question. I don't know. So I'll say right now, I'm not the instructor of record of any class this semester. Our time is really being spent trying to build curriculum, trying to hire the next batch of faculty in the Kravis Department of Integrated Sciences. My time is being spent observing this Codes of Life class, which many of you have probably read about. This is sort of the flagship class that we've rolled out in a couple trial versions already that really tries to show students how we imagine integrating across the natural sciences, the computational sciences, and the social sciences. Our students are thinking about antibacterial resistance, an issue hugely important for public health. Today, we just ran some PCR products that they extracted from the local water treatment plant to look to see if we find antibacterial resistant genes in that system or not. So along the way, then they take their sequences and they do all sorts of really fun Python things to learn. So I'm observing that class with the intention of being one of the instructors for that class in the spring semester, which I'm really super excited about. The students here, by the way, are ridiculously talented. It is insulting how good the students are here. It's an absolute joy to watch them in the classroom. So I'm really excited to be teaching that class. Longer term, I think I'd be really excited to teach classes in my specialty area. So I think a lot about biogeochemistry in the context of climate change. I've taught in the past a lot of sort of quantitative environmental problem solving classes that I think would be really fun. I have a lot of fun teaching students how to write as scientists, and I'd love to teach a class that pulls in those skill sets along the way. Will they be available at Parents' Weekend? I don't know. I assume somebody on this call is in charge of Parents' Weekend and they can tell you, but it's not me. But I'd love to chat with anybody that's interested in what I do at any point, and that includes Parent Weekends if there's an opportunity.
It is President's Day weekend at February 17, 18, 19. So hopefully that Monday we'll have some science courses available. Andy Baldwin says, oftentimes I compost in tubs and they get filled with water and then don't decompose. Would a pond bubbler, other oxygen injection system make the composting work again? I could drain it too, but I'm curious.
Oh, wow, an actual practical question that has to have a yes or no answer. Curse you, Andy Baldwin. So what I would say is that we see this a lot in treatment wetlands, right? That if you look at constructed treatment wetlands, they very often want to keep those things aerobic. And so oftentimes in sort of constructed wetlands, you have these bubblers precisely to do that. Candace has just volunteered to tell you how big of a bubbler you need and at what flow rate you need to be aerating your system to reduce that anaerobic limitation, which I very much appreciate, Candace. So thank you so much. Conceptually, yes, an aerator would bring oxygen into the system, which should accelerate the decomposition if the process has gone anaerobic. One of the challenges with decomposition underwater is that oxygen, it doesn't dissolve very well in water, but it does dissolve a little bit in water. The challenge is that all of your compost has microbes that as soon as some oxygen dissolves in, they're grabbing that oxygen, right? They're scavenging that oxygen because it's a really energetically favorable terminal electron acceptor. And so there's some oxygen dissolving into your system, but it's likely being used up very, very quickly and not penetrating below the water level. So conceptually, yes, aeration should introduce oxygen to your system, and a real engineer could tell you how much oxygen and at what flow rate you could accomplish that goal.
That's great. Someone asked about the research institutes at CMC, specifically in this instance, the Roberts Environmental Center, and curious if you've had much exposure to our research institutes at CMC, the REC, and kind of how those will interact with what you're doing.
So in order, no, I haven't had much experience with them, and I really hope they interact a lot with what I'm doing. Brenwyn Williams, who's another founding faculty member in Kravis Department of Integrated Sciences, is now sort of leading the REC, which I think makes it even easier to build those sorts of connections. I've looked a lot at sort of the work that the analysts in that the student analysts in that group have done in the past, and they're doing some really fascinating work. Be very excited to pitch ideas to them. Would be very excited to sort of serve as a science expert if there's opportunities to serve as a science expert. If you don't think I'm eyeing the Sierra Field Station as a new place for me to go and do research in the summer, you do not know who I am as a person at all. So I haven't had the opportunity to connect with them yet. I'm very aware of what they're doing, and I look forward to building those connections in the future.
Great. We have one last question from Michael. Michael asked about how our SoCal students respond to the idea of wetlands. He's from Oregon, as am I, Michael. Go Ducks. And so he lives near a lot of wetlands, so he tends to use those as his canonical examples. Spending time around them is so different from living in a desert environment.
Yeah,
of course, students are from all over the country and the world too.
Yeah, it's a great question, Michael. Thanks so much. And I will say my PhD advisor is now at the University of Oregon. And so you all live in a pretty spectacular landscape with some pretty phenomenal wetlands as a part of it. My experience with Southern California students from another university is that they've really welcomed it. I think that it does put them a little bit outside of their comfort zone. But I've never had a student that's not willing to be pushed outside of their comfort zone if it means that they get to go up and see a new place, right? And so, I took a student that's never been outside of California in her life up to Minnesota this summer. And we made her put on, knee boots. We made her use the Russian core to take a core 2 meters down. But she gets to walk out into these wetlands with which she's never seen before. And they're a totally different world. And I think she gets a real kick out of it. And what she shared with us is that she really loved it. She's adorable. She bought a little Minnesota t-shirt with like a wolf and a moose on it that she now wears around all the time. So my experience has been that students have really enjoyed it. It's such a fundamentally different landscape than what they see every day. And there's certainly wetlands in Southern California, which are also fascinating. But the opportunity to take students to Minnesota or to Michigan or to Alaska, where I've taken students in the past, I think those are really fun opportunities to show them that there are different places than what they see every day. And for us, talking about how the ecology changes as you move to those different places has really been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. We have run out of time. It's about 5 o'clock. Professor Keller, we do travel with alumni often. In fact, in June, we were in Iceland focusing on climate change. So perhaps you should think about, in addition to all of your great student endeavors, some alumni travel, perhaps to Alaska, where I think we might have a number of people sign up and go and learn firsthand what's happening in the US up north. So big thanks to you, Professor Keller, for your time, your presentation. Hope you continue to engage with our alumni and our parent community. And of course, thanks to all of you. Feel free to unmute, say hello, say goodbye, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Evan. Thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you.